My mother finally resolved that she would join the Marines because the Marines were sending women into New Guinea, which was where Tom was killed, and I think she never really believed that Tom had died. There's reasons for that. When I did my research, I found that his service number was different on the letter about his death than it was in actuality, and they got his middle initial wrong. So, and also I know from personal experience that when somebody dies, you don't always believe that they're really dead. You want proof. So that was her motivation. She joined the Marines. She was hardly 5 feet and about 100 pounds. So she just barely made their requirements. Well, my father was a man of his time. I like to excuse him that way, because he was very much against my mother joining the Marines, and wrote several letters to her and to his mother how disappointed he was. And one of his letters to his mother, he ended with, "I don't believe there's a man in uniform who is in favor of or has a good word to say for women in the services." So my grandmother wrote back to him, and this is her letter in reply. "Of course I knew you would be upset somewhat about Dot going into the Marines, but I frankly did not think it would come quite as hard as it evidently did. As to her physical ability to get through boot training, many have told her she will be home in a week. I don't believe it at all, and I am sure that she has a lot of endurance, or she never would have accomplished all she has done these past almost 2 years with her teaching and her work at the hospital, not to mention that job she took last summer. As for your getting home and not finding her here, you can't tell a thing about that. She might end up being stationed right in New York City, in spite of her wish to travel far. I heard a WAC lieutenant speak at the Women's Club on Wednesday, and she said the main drawback to enlistment in the WACs had been the men. Quite true. It seems to me that your statement that, quote, 'I don't believe there's a man in uniform who is in favor of or who has a good word to say for women in the services,' bears out the fact," she stated. "But I wish you would stop and think about the situation as a whole. It is quite natural for the men overseas to think about home as they left it, instead of realizing that the war has changed everything here, as it has everywhere. It would be ridiculous for them to imagine that the girls they left behind are just going to sit and knit until the men come home again. Instead of sitting and knitting, most women are tending to the furnace, carrying out garbage cans, lugging great bundles of food in their arms, or yes, actually dragging their purchases in children's express wagons. Mrs. Horn up on Berkeley Avenue pushes an empty go-kart down Lawn Ridge Road every Saturday morning and pushes it back up again laden with marketing produce. These are the kind of things that the older women have to do, because there is an age limit for doing the things which are much more attractive in themselves and much more like helping the war effort. But the younger women who have the choice of staying at home and assisting with housework, washing, ironing, and dusting, and cooking, or going out and fitting into a job from which a man has gone into active war service, can hardly be blamed for choosing the latter course. As for Dot, I certainly don't think she has had too thrilling a time here. This war is everybody's war, and she has every right to do what she can if she wants to. If the men can only realize that it isn't a case of women parading around in uniform, but that they are doing tremendously essential things for which there are no civilian men, it would be better than for them to condemn the services for women and expect them to sit around and wait for the end of this damnable war. When women as old as Betty Smith's mother, who is lame and unwieldy large, can work from 7 a.m. until 4 p.m., inspecting parts for life belts in a factory, and everyone praises her for it, I don't think anyone should question its being perfectly suitable for younger women to take war jobs in the Army. Out of boot camp in Camp Lejeune, my mother and her fellow trainees boarded a troop train that was to take them across the country, leaving groups of women at various military bases as they went. She already knew, by the way, that she was assigned to Miramar in San Diego. She wrote, quote, "Along the way we were greeted as if we were returning heroes," unquote. At the little railroad depot in Avery, Mississippi, the women and children of the town welcomed the new recruits. Along with the other women, my mother hung out the train window as supplies were loaded. Through the windows, the townspeople handed trays of sandwiches, candies, cokes, and postcards to the surprised and grateful women in their new uniforms. My mother reported that one woman took her hand through the train window and held it, saying, "You are dear girls, and we are doing this as much for your poor mothers at home as we are for you." As the train pulled away from the station, the crowd yelled and waved, and a young boy ran up and put a flower in my mother's hand. She pressed that flower between the pages of the letter that she wrote home about this train ride. The flower's petals stained the paper so that it was hard for me to read that portion of the letter. When they reached Tucson on a beautiful night in the middle of May, my mother lay awake in her bunk, which was the top of a triple-decker. She wanted to sneak up to the observation car. She kept thinking how lovely it would be out there in the night desert. She had been through this part of the country before on a train much more luxurious, and knew how mysteriously beautiful the desert could be at night. Bed check was at 10 p.m. This is from her letter directly. The lieutenant came through the dark car with a flashlight, checking each girl in her berth. When the lieutenant was safely past, I could stand it no longer, and I climbed down from the bunk, pulled on my trench coat, and walked on silent feet through that car and the next one to the high-domed, windowed car. I stood there in the moonlit car for a long time, watching the night and the miles disappearing down the tracks. So many and so fast, it made me dizzy. That's the end of that passage from the letter. Home and everything she loved and everyone she loved was being swept away from her, a mile further every minute. She stood there. She wondered where this train would take her. It was, at least, that much closer to Tom. She knew from his letters that this was the same route he had taken out to San Francisco, before he boarded that plane and flew on to the Pacific. She wondered what lay ahead of her. Quote, "Maybe the road will lead me to Tom," she wrote home to her sister.